Just a few blocks away from the bustling streets of New York, nestled between aging buildings, lay a forgotten alley. The city lights barely reached this place, and the people here were mostly ignored. Standing against a crumbling wall, a 20-year-old named Jake clutched a pack of cigarettes in his pocket. His eyes burned with frustration, an ever-growing resentment that had festered inside him for years. He was angry at his family, at the system, at himself, and somehow he needed to let that anger out. Then he spotted it. A small stray dog lay trembling in the cold. Its ribs jutted out from its frail body, its thin legs shaking with exhaustion. To Jake, the pathetic creature was the perfect outlet for his rage. He lifted his foot, ready to strike. But just as he swung his leg forward, a voice rang out. "Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" It was weak, but unwavering. Jake turned around, annoyed, and saw an elderly woman standing there. She leaned slightly on a small cane, but her eyes burned with fire. "What did that animal ever do to you?" she demanded firmly. Jake scoffed, letting out a mocking laugh. "What are you gonna do, Grandma? Standing up for this worthless mutt?" The woman took a step forward. Her body was frail, but her courage was unshaken. "Let him go." But Jake only smirked, stepping closer. "And what if I don't?" Fear flickered in the old woman's eyes, but she refused to back down. And just then, from around the corner, another figure appeared. That person was none other than Betty White. Betty White froze for a moment when she heard the faint whimpers of the dog. Her sharp eyes quickly took in the scene unfolding in the dimly lit alley. In front of her, a young man stood threateningly, towering over both a trembling stray dog and the elderly woman who had tried to defend it. Something inside Betty ignited. She had spent a lifetime fighting for animal rights. There was no way she was going to walk past this and pretend it wasn't happening. With firm determination, she stepped forward. "Hey!" Her voice was strong, cutting through the air like a whip. "What do you think you're doing?" Jake turned, startled, and immediately recognized the woman standing before him. That face, he had seen it on television ever since he was a kid. But he didn't care. "Get lost, Grandma. This isn't your problem." Betty's expression hardened. The warm smile she was famous for had vanished. "This is exactly my problem. You're terrorizing a helpless animal and an innocent person. Did you really think no one would stop you?" Jake frowned. "What are you gonna do? Call the cops?" Betty let out a small, knowing smile. I'll call the mayor directly." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Jake's face stiffened. She wasn't bluffing. She was Betty White. She really did have that kind of power. The realization sent a ripple of panic through him. "You can't ruin me," Jake muttered defensively. Betty slowly shook her head. "No. You already did that yourself." For the first time, Jake's confidence wavered. He took a step back, as if grasping the seriousness of what he had done. The anger in his eyes dulled, replaced by uncertainty. "This is being blown way out of proportion," he grumbled. Betty took a deep breath and fixed her piercing gaze on him. "You know what your problem is, Jake. You think this is small, but it's not. Right now, what you're doing means everything to this dog and this woman. Bullying isn't just some harmless act. Today it's a defenseless animal. Tomorrow it's another person. And one day, you won't be able to walk away from the consequences." Jake stood frozen. Only now did he notice the people around them. The street had gone silent, and onlookers had gathered, watching the confrontation unfold. He wasn't just picking a fight with some random old woman. He was challenging a legend. Betty raised her phone to her ear. After a few seconds, she spoke. "Yes, this is Betty White. No, this isn't a joke. I need to report something." Jake's panic spiked. He took a step back. "Okay, fine. I get it. You want me gone? I'm gone." Betty lowered the phone, but didn't hang up. She locked eyes with him and, in a steady voice, said, "Everything we do in this world has consequences. The choices we make determine what happens next." Jake didn't wait for another word. Without looking back, he turned and walked away. The elderly woman wiped tears from her eyes and turned to Betty. "You really saved us." Betty knelt down and gently stroked the trembling dog. Everyone needs a hero sometimes, and sometimes that hero shows up when you least expect it. That day, Betty White didn't just save an animal, she saved a person too. Within minutes, Betty White's phone calls ensured that Jake's actions wouldn't go unpunished. City officials and animal welfare organizations were alerted, and an investigation was set in motion. Betty's influence was undeniable. One call from her could bring attention to something that otherwise might have been ignored. Jake took an uneasy step backward. "I was just angry, okay?" he muttered defensively. Betty White's sharp gaze didn't waver. Being angry is never an excuse to harm an innocent creature. Jake looked away, his confidence unraveling. He slowly retreated, realizing that police and animal protection officers would soon be arriving. In a final act of defiance, he turned and fled the scene. But Betty White knew this wasn't over. The elderly woman who had defended the dog turned to Betty, her hands trembling. You saved me," she whispered. Betty placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We saved all of us. If we had let this go, tomorrow another innocent being would have suffered." She then looked down at the trembling dog, its large eyes filled with both fear and hope. "Now let's find this little one a home." That night, Betty White took the dog to a veterinarian. The poor creature's legs were injured, and its stomach had caved in from hunger. But now it was safe. The next morning, Betty thought about who might give the pup a loving home. One name immediately came to mind: her neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson. The elderly couple had been living alone ever since their children had moved away. Betty walked to their house, gently cradling the small dog in her arms. When Mr. Thompson opened the door, his face lit up. "Betty, what a wonderful surprise. What brings you here?" Betty smiled warmly and held up the tiny dog. "I've brought you a new family member," Mrs. Thompson gasped, her eyes welling up as she reached for the pup. "Oh my, is this little angel ours?" Betty nodded. "If you want him, I know he'll bring you so much joy." And at that moment, the dog's fate changed forever. A few weeks later, Betty White paid a visit to the Thompson home. The once timid pup was now thriving. Its fur was clean, its belly full, and its eyes sparkled with happiness. The elderly couple, too, seemed rejuvenated, their home filled with new energy and laughter. Mrs. Thompson turned to Betty, tears glistening in her eyes. "If it weren't for you, this little one would have been left to suffer alone." Betty gave a small nod. "Everyone has the power to do good, big or small. It doesn't matter. What matters is choosing to listen when someone needs help." For years, Betty White had dedicated herself to protecting animals. That day, one simple act of kindness had not only saved a dog, but also rekindled hope in the hearts of those around her. And perhaps that's how you truly change the world.